Looking back at the year just ending, I am reminded of the topic that has dominated the agenda at the Atlantic Council and most transatlantic think tanks for much of 2010, NATO's new strategic concept. When it was released in November, one could almost hear a collective sigh of relief. But why, I wondered, if this NATO milestone was as important as all of us NATOites sincerely believe it is, did it not even register a blip on Wall Street? Shouldn't it have moved the currency markets a few basis points, one way or another? For an answer to this humbling question, I called Marc Chandler, the chief currency strategist at Brown Brothers Harriman, one of Wall Street's oldest and most hallowed investment banks. Here's my conversation with Marc Chandler.
Well, I think that these are very important decisions, but on the other hand, what influences the price of money is not these kind of things. I think that these kind of, generally speaking, security issues are sort of like the air we breathe, sort of take for granted, and only becomes a more salient issue when it breaks down or there's problems. Because, I mean, it's quite ironic in a way that the United States now is engaged. It looks like we're winding down the war in Iraq, and we still are very much engaged in Afghanistan. But what I'm going to say then, it might sound a bit contradictory, but I think that what's remarkable is that the great powers are at peace now that the Cold War is over. And I don't recall a lot of times when this has happened.
Right.
And because it's at peace, or at least through proxy-type issues like what we're having on the Korean Peninsula perhaps, that it does not become a relevant factor to influence whether you buy Australian mining company or whether you buy a U.S. tech company, or whether a company decides to locate plant and production in the United States or China.
Right.
These are the kind of things that influence people's decisions about what to do with their investment. The general security issues, I think, like I say, are more backdrop that are taken for granted.
But let me try another tack. President Obama recently, or at the Lisbon Summit, made the announcement that everyone had agreed that the Afghan war would go on for another 4 years and then it would start tailoring down. Well, we've just made a commitment to spend $400 to $500 billion, and that doesn't seem to have moved the market. Now, that's fairly good change, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is good change. It's some serious money, but again, it's over 4 years, and we're talking about a U.S. having a deficit now of over $1 trillion.
You're right.
And so, but I do think that one is that as people think about defense spending and how we're going to make the budget, how we're going to reach some kind of fiscal austerity, I think that if I understand signals from Washington, everything is on the table, including some ways of making the military cheaper.
Right.
But in addition to that, I think that one of the most remarkable things I think about what's going on and about the fiscal cost of these wars is that at the end of the day, the reason people like myself might oppose these kind of wars is not really because of the military cost. Because if anything, the cost of these operations are relatively modest compared to, say, other wars like Vietnam. And in some ways, it's the sad tragedy of this, or one of the sad tragedies, is that we are able to fight these wars relatively cheaply. And so I think that is for me, that's the real, that there might be some serious political, strategic, ideological reasons why the U.S. should be curtailing our foreign expansion strategy or our foreign military involvement. But the cost of it doesn't seem to be the most compelling argument.
China, which is these days our banker, and everyone says that gives them undue leverage. Do you think it does?
I think objectively, the fact that China owns right now about $850 billion worth of U.S. treasuries, and that doesn't mention anything else they might own as Chinese investors, might own agency bonds and corporate bonds and stocks, in fact.
Right.
But just as far as the reserve holdings, about $850 billion, I don't think that it becomes an issue, a chit, if you will, in the negotiations between the U.S. and China, and for several reasons. One is I'd say that we find the same problem in the United States. To convert our financial power into political influence is very difficult. And not just the U.S. had this experience. Brit Forrest had the same problem. Russia had that same problem. One way to illustrate the problem is you look at the recipients of U.S. foreign aid,
right,
and then you make another list of how countries vote at the UN. It's very hard to find a correlation between those two columns. And so similarly, I think that China is also going to find it increasingly difficult to convert its financial power into political presence and influence.
I see.
For example, in East Asia, where the U.S. has been criticized under President Bush for ignoring or marginalizing Asia, that the rise of China would seem to be we've lost Asia. But in fact, many countries now are encouraging the U.S. to come back, as it were, to help offset the huge giant on their borders,
Right.
whether it comes to border disputes or just to offset the Chinese presence. And so I think that U.S. confrontation with China takes place on a number of different fronts: trade, global warming, currency policy, North Korea. And I think one issue doesn't mean that we want to let it sabotage progress on another issue.
So you don't think that sitting down in the privacy of their negotiations, the Chinese can realistically say, hey, we'll dump all these dollars if you don't agree with this? I mean, that's not a threat that they can make.
The case study for this is really the Suez Crisis. Britain and Israel and France, they invade Egypt. This is the heart of the Cold War. The U.S. and Russia, Soviet Union are on the same side of the UN. They say the belligerents get back. And, of course, they don't. It's just the UN, right? And so the U.S. calls up Great Britain and says, if you do not get right with the UN, not only won't we loan you dollars to sell so you can defend the British pound in Bretton Woods, we have some British pounds ourselves, we'll sell those. And that IMF package that you need, that large package you want, we're going to veto it. Britain capitulates.
Right.
And then, of course, France does, and then a few months later, Israel does. The question really is, can a country do that to us, the U.S.?
Right.
And could a country like China, which, as you say, has so much U.S. treasuries, like I say, roughly, treasuries figures about $850 billion. Could China say, if you'd send a nuclear-armed ship to the Straits of Taiwan or the South China Sea, we're going to sell treasuries? Then what should the U.S. do? I suspect that the U.S. would call China's bluff. So China would begin selling some treasuries. As soon as word got out that China was selling treasuries for political purposes, what happens? Well, treasuries could sell off hard. And then what happens? The U.S., one of China's biggest export markets, goes into recession. Worst case, we go into recession because China sells treasuries, drives up U.S. interest rates. Now we can't buy so many Chinese goods. And what happens to China? They get hit themselves. And maybe on things like social stability. Secondly, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe China tries to sell treasuries, and then, as you know, the Federal Reserve recently announced it was going to be buying $600 billion worth of treasuries over the next year.
Right.
Does it really matter whether the Federal Reserve buys them from a U.S. bank or whether they buy them indirectly from China? So that point is really that the market is bigger than China.
Right.
And the third point, so the first point is China might do it and cut their nose to spite their face.
Let me switch to Europe then. Is the euro in existential danger?
The market underestimates the political will to keep Europe moving in this direction. It's really a transgenerational dream. The European Monetary Union is in its infancy. It's just almost 11 years old. They haven't worked out these issues yet. I think they will. I think that means that the EMU of 5 years from now looks a bit different than the EMU today. Not that people are going to drop out, but that the institutional capacity will increase. There'll be innovation and reform to make this monetary union experiment more viable. And it probably will include some more encroachments on traditional sovereignty and more collective action without necessarily requiring unanimity in decision-making.
You've been listening to a conversation with Mr. Marc Chandler of Brown Brothers Harriman on behalf of the Atlantic Council. This is Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for listening.